How's everyone doing this evening?
Great.
Well, you all look beautiful, and we are very, very happy to welcome everyone into the space. How many of you have been here before? That's a good number. Welcome back. And those of you who have never been here, welcome to the People's Forum. The People's Forum is what we call a working class movement incubator. We are here in support of working class movements. We believe that if we unify, we build strength. And this space is a space that convenes a lot of different social movements in New York City and internationally. We are very proud to say we've been here for 16 months and have held over 1,500 events. Classes, cultural performances, and everything with the commitment to advancing the struggle of the working class in the United States and outside of the United States. So welcome to what we hope will become your political home. And just maybe saying my name would be helpful. My name is Claudia de la Cruz. I'm the executive director and part of the collective of folks that put this space together. And we are very excited. We are delighted to have Judith Butler here in the space and Simon Critchley. We are delighted. We knew we would get a lot of people, but God gracious. I'm really hopeful that the folks, we're trying to do our best for the folks in the overflow room to be able to have access to the lecture, to the conversation that is going to happen here. So we're working on that. Apparently, folks are listening to us. Can we get an applause for the audio person? Juan, thank you so much. And I want to just make an announcement. The person who would usually welcome and would speak in the launches of books is our director of research, who's not here and is giving a talk on Paul Rosen in Philly right now, is the director of research, Jordan Camp. I wanted to direct your attention to the screens. There is a series of events that are going to be taking place in the next couple of months during the spring that is called Interpreting the Crisis. And so we will have conversations with authors that are launching new books and folks that are coming to speak about artists like and socialists like Elizabeth Catlett. How many of us know who she was? Well, it's good to learn about Elizabeth Catlett. She made a lot of contributions for our social movements. And so there's a lot that will be happening, and you could, again, put your attention to the screens. We also have that information online. But without further ado, I want to introduce our speakers properly. And so, excuse me, I will read to make that happen. Judith Butler is Maxine Elliott Professor in the Departments of Rhetoric and Comparative Literature at the University of California, Berkeley. She is author of many books, including Frames of War, Precarious Life, The Psychic Life of Power, Excitable Speech, Bodies That Matter, and Gender Trouble. Can we give an applause to Judith Butler? Simon Critchley is a Hans Jonas Professor of Philosophy at the New School for Social Research. His work engages in many areas: continental philosophy, philosophy and literature, psychoanalysis, ethics, and political theory, amongst others. His most recent books include The Problem with Levinas, an ABC of Impossibility. As moderator of The Stone at New York Times, Critchley asked philosophers to weigh in on the contemporary issue in art, literature, politics, and popular culture. Can we give a round of applause to Simon?
Thank you, Claudia.
I also want to let folks know that if you didn't notice when you came in, please do make a stop at the table of Word Up that has the new book. I just got it. I've read through most of its pages. Really awesome. So please do make a stop. We're going to have some time for signing at the end. So without further ado, we want to welcome Simon and Judith. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Claudia. Thank you. Is this one on?
I think so.
Yeah? Okay.
No?
No? Okay.
Here. Let Butch take care of it.
How's that? Okay, so we've never met before, have we? Never met before, and
It's not true, he's just joking.
there's no particular plan for what we're going to say. But it's Friday evening, everybody having a nice time? Yes. And Claudia, thank you very much for the introduction, and this is a fantastic space to do this event in. And this event is to mark, to celebrate Judith Butler's latest book, The Force of Nonviolence. Well, as you might already be able to tell, I haven't got much prepared in the way of organized remarks, but I have some thoughts. And the first, so we're going to just have a conversation. This will be quite informal. And I want to I want to focus on a passage of the book in order to bring out some of the themes. Because the important thing about Judith's work, if you don't know, for me, is its dialectical character. Its dialectical character and the fact that it's not a metaphysics. Right? This is a dialectical work which comes out of readings. Right? This focus on reading. So to try and get some sense of how the themes that are in this book and how these themes are elaborated. And these themes, as readers of Judith's work will know, interconnected over the years, but have developed in very interesting ways. And the first thing I want to do, or ask, is really about that, which is, here we are in whatever year this is, the Force of Nonviolence, and then to talk about maybe how this work emerged. It's lectures that were given in 2016, 2018, 19, 4 lectures and a postscript. But really how this work connects with earlier work. And I don't mean, what I mean by that in particular is that, at least in my, as a follower of your work for decades, for me there was a sort of shift around precarious life. Not a break, not a change, but there was a shift in intensity, a shift of themes. And this work I see very much as in a development of those themes. So I was wondering if you could begin by talking about that, how this work emerged and why you felt compelled to write it.
Okay. Well, thank you. First of all, I'm very pleased to be here and honored to be in this particular place and to be associated with an institution that is trying to support social movements at this time and affirming the working class as a thread that runs through various social movements. I think there was a time in the left or on the left where you were either in favor of social movements or you were part of new social movements. And now I believe we are starting to see coalitions emerging where working class questions of poverty, questions of economic precarity, globally considered, locally considered, are running through social movements and revising those terms. So I see this as a moment really where the left is achieving a greater profundity and a greater complexity in its analysis and in its motion. So I'm particularly pleased to be here and sponsored. I think we should be supporting this institution and others like it because, in my view, I would never, as it were, come out against parliamentary democracy. I mean, I think we need that and it's a good thing, but I also believe democracy takes place in ways that are outside of established parliaments. Sometimes they are street parliaments or assemblies or gatherings. They're in unions, they're in various kinds of organizations that run through civil society and on the margins of civil society, and we need to be able to understand that as part of a radical democratic structure, one that we need to preserve economically and philosophically, if I can speak that way. Simon, I'm particularly pleased to be here with you. Some time ago, you and I had some discussions about anarchism, and we had some discussions about Walter Benjamin's famous essay, The Critique of Violence, which shows up in this book and which you have written about. And I remember at that time when we were in conversation with some younger anarchist groups. I'm older than Simon, so I shouldn't really put him in my generation, but he is,
Not that
he's
much
getting
older
there.
than
He's getting there.
I am getting there. Yeah.
You're going to catch up with me at some point.
Yeah, I know. Yeah.
I'm waiting.
Yeah.
But still, I think there were some really crucial questions that reemerge on the left, and one of them, especially among anarchists, was, well, violence. What's the status of violence as a strategy? Is there a difference between violence committed against property, especially in a capitalist system, where property is the condensation of capitalism itself and its emblem, of violence against people, against institutions? How do we think about that? And then again, I think I was aware during the Occupy movement that there were other groups that tended to come in, and they had more violent aims than the Occupy movement did. And there was a question: how do we think about those who want to ride this particular wave and put it and steer it in a more violent direction? And I think we've seen that, and of course, all of this takes place in a context in which police violence has been intensified, especially against people of color, but also against democratic protest and assembly, and that's true in the U.S., as we see in the targeting of Black Lives Matter by the police, but also in India right now. The students have been the student protesters have suffered appalling violence that has been waged by the state and condoned by the universities themselves. We see it in Hong Kong, and we see it also in Chile, where some of the same dictatorial practices have resurfaced. We thought they were gone. No, some people thought they were gone. Yeah. But there they were in full form, right? In full form against student protesters and people on the street, especially those who were objecting not only to neoliberalism, but to sexual violence, right? And to have your protest against sexual violence met with violence is a kind of appalling phenomenon that we need to be able to understand. We need more translations. We need more popular understanding of what's happening in all of these domains. So one problem, of course, as we think about nonviolence, I mean, it seems like such a weak position. It seems like such a improbable thing. It seems like morally pure during a time in which none of us can afford moral purity. One of the problems, of course, is that we're surrounded by violence, and many people will say, look, violence doesn't start with us. So violence comes upon us. We're living in a world of violence. We live in a force field of violence. So the question like, should I or should I not be violent, posed as an individual moral question, seems a little out of sync with a social and political analysis of violence that is pervasive. But I want to suggest that, well, two things. First, that maybe the question of violence is not really an individual one. I mean, each of us have to deal with that question, whether we will respond to conflictual situations with violence. And that's especially true in domestic and intimate relations, where unfortunately there continues to be extraordinary amounts of violence, sometimes sexual violence, sometimes other forms of brutality. But I would also say that we have to think of ourselves socially and ask the question of nonviolence and the question of violence as social creatures, that is to say, as creatures who are related to one another and who have to live in this world together. And the question becomes a little different when we don't take individualism as our point of departure. It becomes a question of how do we want to live together? What does cohabitation mean on this earth? How do we support the bonds that allow us to live together without violence, maybe with conflict but without violence, with aggression but without violence?
Right. We come back to this. Yeah. This is
Yes, and then of course also there's this big question, which is, can violence ever be a mere strategy, right? Can it just be a strategy? It's like, well, I'm going to do violence here, or we're going to do violence here to achieve this other goal, a goal we might call justice or freedom or equality, or we're going to just do it as a strategy. It's an instrument to achieve certain ends. Does it ever just remain an instrument, or have we, despite our best intentions, put more violence into the world and made the world into a more violent place? In other words, have we helped to normalize violence? Have we helped to make violence even more pervasive? And that's a question I think we can only ask from the position of the plural we. We have to actually think of ourselves as situated in a world and on an earth and with one another and bound to one another in certain ways, so that when we act violently, it seems to me that we break a bond, we break a social bond, we attack a social bond, and we also, no matter how instrumental we think we're being, we produce more violence, or we produce a more violent world. And I just think that if we reorient ourselves in that way, we ask a different set of questions. So you began by asking me about my itinerary, and as you know, I'm notoriously bad at giving an account of myself.
That's why I asked you.
Okay, but here I'll come around and I'll just say this. Some of the work I did on Palestine and cohabitation, trying to think about what cohabitation would look like if it didn't reproduce the status quo of colonial domination, right? I mean, one reason coexistence is kind of a word that sounds pretty, but very often is a kind of ethical ideal that doesn't approach the economic and political problem of colonial domination of Palestine by the State of Israel. And then the question is, well, what could we posit? What could we imagine as a cohabitation that would emerge through radical decolonization, right? Like, what's that imagining that could be opened up? That's a different idea. It would be one that actually presumes equality. So that notion of equality then re-enters into my thinking about nonviolence, because I do believe that nonviolence does commit us to a notion of radical social equality, and we can talk about that.
Well, can we get, because this is, because this, I mean, for me, I mean, you know, I know that you're very self-effacing.
Oh, that's not true.
Oh, it is true. You're very self-effacing. You're very humble. But for me, you're the most, and you have been the most important philosopher the last decades. And the fact that you don't teach in a philosophy department speaks volumes about the discipline that I happen to be involved.
No, it's also my choice. I mean,
yeah, is it? Yeah, but there's so that with that,
you guys would have let me back in.
Embarrassing remark. But what I like about reading your work is it's readings, you build up arguments, themes, and then sometimes you're thinking, where is this going to go? Where is this taking us? And then there are moments when the sentences begin to kind of accelerate and compact. There's moments of focus and dilation. And this happens all over this book, as with your other books. But when I was thinking this morning, sitting in the Carroll Gardens diner, and thinking, what on earth are we going to do tonight? I was looking at the book, and we have 4 lectures and a postscript. And I thought, postscript, that's a bit of a cop-out. That's the kind of thing that I do in a book. But I looked at the postscript, and it's very interesting. And also there's a moment at the end where all of the themes seem to crystallize and come together. And I think it's to do justice to the book. I want to go through some of that. And I think it will allow us to touch on the themes in the book. So I'm going to quote, as it were, ventriloquize you and quote you back to yourself a little bit and see what you think. This is really, if you have the book, and you should get the book, right? It's not that expensive. And I'm reading from page 201, so right at the end of the postscript. And Judith writes, to avow vulnerability not as an attribute of the subject, but as a feature of social relations, does not imply vulnerability as an identity, a category, or a ground for political action. Right? So this postscript is also, because one thing that could be attributed to your work, that you've made vulnerability central, and vulnerability linked, kind of ethics of vulnerability, ethics of care could be a basis for political action. No, in this postscript, you're making that very crystal clear. Rather, you say persistence in a condition of vulnerability proves to be its own kind of strength. So it's this persistence of vulnerability. That's the first thought. Not, and then we get, next paragraph, the prejudice against nonviolence as passive and useless implicitly depends upon a gendered division of attributes by which masculinity stands for activity and femininity for passivity. No transvaluation of those values will defeat the falsehood of that binary opposition. Indeed, the power of nonviolence, its force, the force of nonviolence, is found in the modes of resistance to a form of violence that regularly hides its true name. And then, moving slightly further, nonviolence exposes the ruse by which state violence defends itself against black and brown people, queer people, the migrant, the homeless, the dissenters, as if they were taken together so many vessels of destruction, who must, for security reasons, be detained, incarcerated, expelled. The soul force that Gandhi had in mind, and you begin with this idea of soul force, of satyagraha in Gandhi, it's in one of your epigraphs to the book, was never fully separable from an embodied stance as a way of living in the body and persisting precisely under conditions that attack the very conditions of persistence. So, I mean, what I see in that passage is we begin with vulnerability, then we get this, the thought of nonviolence at the opposite of passivity and giving up. Nonviolence as a force which consists in, question, what kind of force? Well, a kind of soul force. Mm-hmm. What is that? And you are characterizing nonviolence in terms of force, aggression, persistence, rage, all those things. So I guess for people in the audience, if you're listening to a talk on nonviolence, you might think this is all going to be peaceful and nice, but your idea of nonviolence is very forceful. So how can we talk about that? Mm-hmm. The force of nonviolence. Mm-hmm.
Well, maybe let's go back to the idea of persistence.
Mm-hmm.
And what is it to persist in a condition of vulnerability? I mean, there are, yes, those who work within public policy frameworks that designate so-called vulnerable groups. Mm-hmm. Right, this group is vulnerable, this one is not, this vulnerable group deserves protections, legal protections, mm-hmm. or special social services, and both legal and regulatory structures are built in order to represent the vulnerable. And in some cases, that's extremely important. And I wouldn't do away with that category altogether. But I do see there in that a risk, because sometimes vulnerability is then inscribed in the identity, so that a group is sort of stuck as a vulnerable group, as opposed to a non-vulnerable group, an invulnerable group, a group that is, I don't know what the opposite of vulnerability is at that in that framework. But I worry that those categories can enclose or encase a group of people and become a kind of identity they have to have. For instance, on the Greek island of Leros and elsewhere, when they're processing migrants to come into Europe, they have asked them to fill out vulnerability papers, right? And you have to have you have to establish your vulnerability, and you have to have it ratified or validated.
Right.
So like, here's my vulnerability. It's like, you know, it's like, okay. But you know, it takes something to like put the vulnerability paper together. You know, you've got a group of people working. How do we build your vulnerability? How do we, you know? And the problem is that it, first of all, they're individual cases, so that's an individuating strategy. Where, you know, where's the solidarity? Where's the social movement? Where's the grassroots activism? Where's the social mobilization? Very often, people who get called vulnerable are made into individual cases rather than understood as people who are engaged in a common effort to achieve a livable life or to cross a border in order to escape persecution, violence, in order to secure some livelihood or safety. And they are doing that very often, as we know, through resistance communities and collaborative activities and solidarities that are both virtual and physical. And that goes missing. That goes missing from the categorization of vulnerability in that way.
Right.
So in my view, one can be exceedingly vulnerable in the sense of, you know, differentially exposed to violence or part of a group that is, at the same time persisting, opposing that violence. And that's not a contradiction.
Right.
And I suppose the other thing I worry about is that those who understand vulnerability as something to be solved or resolved imagine invulnerability or mastery as the ideal state to be achieved. And I don't think that's right. I mean, or it's like, oh, now you're an individual who's master of your fate. It's like, great, you escaped your vulnerability. No, you want to be part of a social world, right? You want to be part of a social world in which you can live your vulnerability freely. You can live your passion without fear. You can exist as a body on the street without fear of being attacked. You don't want to overcome or negate your vulnerability to be a master or an individual. You want to live it freely with others and in ways that actually allow for passion and freedom and a sensory engagement with the world.
So a kind of ontology of social relations as well, this idea of this phrase in precarious life that we're undone by each other. Right?
Well, yes, and
if we don't understand that, we don't understand anything. We don't.
Well, and it doesn't. I mean, even to be undone by each other doesn't mean you're never going to stand up again. I mean.
Sure.
If you can stand, or that you'll never move down the street. You know, to be undone is to recognize that we are in each other's hands, and to some degree we are radically social. We're atrociously social, and we're splendidly social. And I'm not sure we really get to escape that bind. I mean, there are many ways to escape that bind, right? And we can name those strategies, and that's part of what's wrong with the world. But I'm kind of trying to focus on that as something that we can accept and work with, and that we know in forms of solidarity that are part of resistance movements. Yes, the feminists on the street in Chile, they're walking down streets where they are at risk, you know, but they're walking down them together, and they're laying claim to that street. And in Argentina, in the Ni Una Menos movement, you know, there's a great moment where all these women flood the streets where they're afraid to walk at night. And they just say, the street is our home. And they push the police off the street, right? They just push, there's just no room for the police. Right. They're not relying on the police for any protection. They, you know, that is their home. They've made that otherwise difficult public space into their home. Now did they overcome their vulnerability? No, they're out there with it, but they're also in a mode of solidarity that's insisting on being able to live it publicly.
And that's the force.
That's enormous force.
Yeah.
And it's not an individual heroism. It's not like my individual force or my heroic act. You know, I think that this book is anti-heroic.
Yes, yeah. And I'm just going to keep dipping into this passage because there's so much. I think all the key themes are here. 202. You talk about the practice of nonviolence as a force of strength, and you list refusal. You talk about examples of refusal, which are examples of the force of nonviolence. Refusal is not the same as doing nothing. The hunger striker refuses to reproduce the prisoner's body, indicting the carceral powers that are already attacking the existence of the incarcerated. You know, someone from where I'm from would think about the Bobby Sands and the Maze prison and all of that. Then you say the strike may not seem like an action, but it asserts its power by withdrawing labour that's essential to the continuation of a capitalist form of production. So the hunger strike, then the strike in general, then civil disobedience may seem like a simple opting out, but it makes public a judgment that a legal system is not just. It requires the exercise of an extra legal judgment. To breach the fence or the wall that's decided to keep people out is precisely to exercise an extra legal claim to freedom. And finally, to boycott a regime. And you don't name a regime here.
Well, there are several, but I'm happy to name them.
Right, the continuous colonial
I'm
rule,
not shy.
intensifying
I'm not
dispossession, displacement, and disenfranchisement. So if we're talking about the force of nonviolence, and then in terms of actual examples, you know, instances of this, we have refusal, the hunger strike, civil disobedience, the breaching of a wall, the activity of a boycott. These would be different modes of the force of nonviolence. Yeah.
I think that's right. I think the passage that you read, which seems strange to me, I trust you that I wrote it, but this is why I don't give a good account of myself. I mean, it sounds right. I mean, I agree with.
Sounds kind of right.
You know, I'd sign up for that one, but people imagine that authorship is like deeply intentional.
I know.
It's kind of.
I know.
Okay.
Well, I've got. Okay, go on. Okay, go.
No, I was just going to say that I think we sometimes have certain notions of what true action is, and there can be some very masculinist ideas of true action. And I mean, I went to some anti-fascist rallies in the Bay Area where I was surprised that there were men ready for action and women in the background, you know, preparing the way for them or preparing to receive them after their big action. And I just thought, well, this doesn't seem like other demonstrations I've been to in the last 20 years, you know, like I thought we were kind of working that through. And you know, it doesn't mean I'm not anti-fascist. I do take myself to be an anti-fascist, and I take the movement itself to be complex, so I'm not making a summary judgment here. But I did see a renewed kind of, like a liberated masculinism on the left.
Right.
Where
we've been there before, right?
A certain kind of action, certain kind of willing to go into violent combat, and you know, women were, and feminism too is like immediately secondary, right? That's a secondary oppression. It's like, oh gosh, we haven't been a secondary oppression for a really long time. Like I don't even remember like when we were a second. It's like I got to get used to that again. Anyway, so, you know, I just think, you know, what is our idea of acting effectively against fascism? Like,
exactly.
Well, part of what it is to act effectively against fascism is not the heroic individual, I'm going to fight this fascist face to face, but like, let's build
punch him in the face.
Well, let's build modes of solidarity, right, on the basis of equality that are actually contagious and remarkable. And irresistible, right? I mean, and that is a very different approach. And I think that that's, it moves away from masculinist ideas of individualism and towards another idea of social solidarity, one that would be based on notions of equality, and not just men and women, but all genders, including the non-gendered among us. I myself am now technically, legally non-binary. I don't think I've told you.
No.
Okay, just thought I'd let you know. California, you know, there's a box to check. It's like, oh, I'm going to check that one. Like, that box has been waiting for me, or I don't know, maybe I helped to make that box. You know, what do I know?
I think you helped to make that box.
Yeah, why not?
Can we? Yeah, go on. Yeah, go on. Yes, yeah. Absolutely right. Equality, I want to just talk about equality a little bit, because, again, that might sound like something that people understand. You say you're in favour of equality, hooray. But your argument for equality is very singular, right? You talk about non-violence to escape the war logics must become part of a politics of equality, thus an intervention in the sphere of appearance, Arendtian there, media, and permutations of the public sphere is required to make every life grievable, that is worthy of its own living, deserving of its own life. To demand that every life be grievable is another way of saying that all lives ought to be able to persist in their own living, blah, blah. So it's the linking, which wouldn't be the way in which a standard kind of political philosopher would do it, right, between equality and grievability. And this is something which is incredibly important in your work, grievability, and you keep coming back to. And that grievability is something that everybody is entitled to, right? But grievability itself is a peculiar relation, right? To grieve for someone is not, is a kind of asymmetrical relation, right? It's not, a straightforward symmetry. To grieve for the other is to attribute them with a certain height, a certain distinction. So your formulation of equality also, and the way it's linked to grief, also allows for this different kind of understanding of social structures. What about that?
It's true. This is, I think, one of the more difficult notions to explain, and I keep thinking, oh, I explained it, and then I realized I didn't. And but let me say something first, which is that there are two parts of my idea of social equality, and one has to do with interdependency, which involves being interdependent within an economic world, and also dependent on the earth and on each other for persisting in our own lives. The second has to do with grievability, and let's think about what that possibly means. Most people think, well, somebody becomes grievable once they're gone, once they're dead, once we've lost them. But what if grievability is a feature of the living? That some people live with a sense of who they are and the value of their own life, such that were they lost, were they to die, they would be grieved.
Yeah.
And others live with a felt sense that this life, if it were effaced from the world, if it were lost, would leave no trace and would not be mourned.
Yeah.
Okay, so phenomenologically speaking, what would it mean to live as a person or as part of a community where you feel or you experience life, your own life, as something that would not be grieved or is not considered worthy of grief? Now, you live it as a living being. You're in your world, your work or your home or your public space or wherever you are, you live it in that way. This life could be lost at any moment and would leave no mark and would not matter. Okay, so I want to say that there are that grievability is unequally distributed throughout the world, right? And certain populations their lives are preserved and considered to be enormously valuable and protected at all costs, and others are abandoned without a second thought by major powers, by which I mean, yes, states, but also corporations, as we see, for instance, in the Brazilian rainforest right now. So I'm trying to suggest that we need to think about, we say abstractly, I consider all lives to be equally valuable, right? And if you're a good abstract liberal, like that's the end. You say the claim, everyone says, yes, I agree, and you're done for the day,
Right.
You get
and
paid.
you're not saying that.
Yeah, you get paid, you go out to dinner.
Right.
But I think that the problem there is that it's a totally formal and abstract notion of equality, and it sometimes also assumes that we're assuming the individual as the unit. But a radical notion of social equality and a radical critique of social inequality does not take the individual as the unit. It actually thinks about social inequality as distributed among, we can invoke, again, the working class, but we can also invoke poverty, we can invoke racial and ethnic minorities, we can invoke the indigenous, and it's always relational. It's like, in somebody's view, this group is or is not grievable. And that, it can be that, and it usually is the case, that a group may understand its own lives to be grievable, whereas others do not understand their lives to be grievable, and that's the source of a certain kind of social conflict. The "yes, we are grievable" is a placard. I mean, the Palestinian placard, "we exist." I mean, you could say, well, that's, yeah, so you exist. What's that? That's nothing. It's like, no, that is something, because that is an assertion against the attribution of non-existence, right? Oh, there is no Palestine. There's no Palestinian people.
Yeah.
These propositions actually function in public policy and international debate. There's no Palestine. There's no Palestinian state. There couldn't be a state because there's no Palestine, right? So we exist, but also in the media, which effaces it, right? I mean, all of this talk about a Middle East peace. I don't even get me started on the, which is just like annexation as peace. Really, the decimation of Palestine as peace. The denial of the existence of Palestine as peace.
Jared's got it all sorted out.
Jared, we should do Jared. In any case, I mean, I do think that if we go back to persistence, like we exist, we are losable. Our lives matter when they are lost. There is a collective right to persistence, and I think that that's politically meaningful. But we can't understand it if our notions of equality don't take into account the battle against ungrievability, the attribution of ungrievability.
Yeah, politically meaningful. But again, to praise your work, it's political. It's not just that. You've been working this out for decades. Right? I think of the Antigone book, which is a site where the question of grief is worked out. So it's this. I think what's so powerful about what you do is the continuity between the most rigorous theoretical work, reading of texts, right, and it's not political consequences. These are two faces of the same activity of thought, and that's often what's, I think, lost or overlooked these days. That the idea that we can apply stuff and things. It's not. Yeah. Anyway. So, but look, next bit. This is interesting to me. It's interesting. You then say, quoting you again, to counter the scheme of lethal phantasmagoria, it's a term that you develop in relationship to psychoanalytic theories of fantasy. Lethal phantasmagoria that so often justifies police violence against black and brown communities, military violence against migrants, and state violence against dissidents. A new imaginary is required. an egalitarian imaginary that apprehends the independency of lives. Unrealistic and useless? Yes. Unrealistic and useless? Yes. But it is possibly a way of bringing another reality into being that does not rely on instrumental logics. The unrealism of such an imaginary is its strength. Right? So that distinction you're making there between phantasmagoria, as in a way the kind of the circulation of fantasies, images that which is a condition of tyranny in the book. Right? So tyranny works through a phantasmagoria of images. We don't need to mention, him, but we know what we mean. And you're opposing that, distinguishing that, not from realism, but from an idea of the imaginary. An imaginary whose strength is an unrealism, a uselessness. Could you say some more about that? I mean, there's a kind of, it's not quite utopian, but it's almost, there's sort of a nudging more towards that in your thinking.
Well, you're very kind to me, but I do think this is maybe the least worked out distinction in the book. But let me give it a go. Well, the notion of phantasmagoria comes in when I'm trying to understand the following problem. The state or the police attribute violence to the targets of their own violence, right? So there are about 6 instances of Black or brown people who are said to be violent or about to be violent, who show no signs of violence, who are killed by the police, and the police exonerate themselves by saying this person was about to be violent or was violent, relying on a notion that a Black man is nothing other than potential violence, or that Black and brown people are vessels of violence, or migrants are vessels of violence. We see this phantasmagoria being popularized all the time. I believe that our president did decide to say that again in his State of the Union. So the question that I'm interested in is how is the violence externalized so that the police, in inflicting violence against an unarmed person, can say that they were defending themselves against violence and make a case that is plausible in a court and that a jury will accept or that a judge will accept. In what world is that possible? Right? And it's a world of shared phantasms, what I refer to as racial phantasms, which accept that, oh, this person, this image of this person, I can see in this image of this person a potential violence or an actual violence, even though it's not in any way manifest, but it's attributed and it's a shared attribution. So it relies on that shared attribution to make a legal judgment that exonerates the police from their violence. So the way in which violence gets attributed to those who are targeted by state violence is an important kind of object of analysis in this book. At the same time, there's another effort towards the end, or maybe throughout, to say that we shouldn't settle for a realpolitik. We shouldn't settle for realism, like, oh, well, what can we do now? Like, well, who's really electable, like what's, don't we need to just, like, do what we can within the conditions of this historical situation to make some change? It's like, well, and then if you hold out for something that is impossible or unrealistic, like nonviolence, you're considered to have taken yourself out of the political conversation. You're either irrational or you're engaging in baseless utopia or something of the sort. But I want to suggest that being dismissed as unrealistic is actually a badge of courage. Like it's actually important to hold out to ask what is thinkable, what are the limits on thought, what's the limits on our thinking of what is equality, what are the limits on our thinking about violence, what are the limits of our thinking about democracy, radical democracy, you know, I mean, why not make a fool of oneself? You know, in a world that believes that the refusal to accept reality as it is somehow irrational. So there is I call it unrealism rather than utopia, because I don't have an image or a blueprint of a world to come, but it is an aspirational moment, and it's an effort to try to find within existing solidarities, and you named some of them right there, these aspirational moments that allow us to open up the horizon of thought beyond conventional realism.
And this passage, the book finishes in the following way. You might not remember this. Yeah. This is how the book finishes. We do not have to love one another to engage in meaningful solidarity. I want to come back to the question of love, because that's a different theme in your work, it seems to me, particularly in this book. But look, you then say, when nonviolence becomes the desire for the other's desire to live, when nonviolence becomes the desire for the other's desire to live, a way of saying, and then you quote, in quotation marks, you are grievable. The loss of you is intolerable. I want you to live. I want you to want to live. So take my desire as your desire, for yours is already mine. It's very you. I mean, yeah. And the I is not you, yet it remains unthinkable without the you, wordless, unsustainable. And listen to this, all right? So whether we're caught up in rage or love, rageful love, militant pacifism, aggressive nonviolence, radical persistence, each of those terms has an oxymoronic structure. And you're deliberately, because what the other we've not mentioned yet is this is a deeply psychoanalytic book, right? Freud is kind of the weird political hero.
Oh, I hope not, yeah.
No, he is. No, he is.
He helps me along sometimes.
Yeah, he does. But, I mean, to think psychoanalysis is to think always in terms of contradiction and ambivalence, right? The drive points two ways, always, right? So if we want to settle that, the way philosophers want to tidy that up, we're missing the point. So you say militant pacifism, rageful love, aggressive nonviolence, radical persistence. Let us hope that we live that bind in ways that lets us live with the living, mindful of the dead, demonstrating persistence in the midst of grief and rage, the rocky and vexed trajectory of collective action in the shadow of fatality. Now, knowing your work as I do, or having read your work as I do, that it's not exactly a kind of, you know, the music raises, it's like that, and then it's kind of qualified in ambivalence always, because you have to think in terms of we're ambivalent creatures. We love and we hate. And which does come first? Right? How do we divide that up? Hate is older than love, Freud says. And it's the last word, trajectory of collective action. That sounds nice. In the shadow of fatality. It's always that, right? So I think about when we were teaching tragedy together in 2011, and when you were talking about Oedipus. Is Oedipus free or determined by fate? Right? Oedipus the king? Is he free or determined? And the point is both. Right? And fate isn't determinism. Fate isn't something which we're not programmed like puppets, right? By fate. Fate is something we bring down, we articulate, we bring it down on ourselves freely, and we can destroy ourselves at that point. We can also liberate ourselves at that point. And that's, so that ambivalence at the end I find fascinating. It's not a question. Actually.
No, I mean, it is a question in a way.
It's a tragic structure to your thinking.
There is a tragic
structure.
There is a tragic structure.
The tragic structure to your thinking is what I'm saying.
To some degree, but then I also have this other aspirational part that maybe moves beyond. I was thinking today that, one of the things that very often happens in psychoanalysis or psychotherapy is that people are asked to acknowledge their murderous wish. And sometimes it's the very last thing to be acknowledged, or, people say, oh, I don't have those wishes, other people have those wishes, I've never wished any such thing. Like, oh, that's not true.
Yeah, me and my mother are best friends.
Yeah. But what's interesting is that most arguments for pacifism, and there's a local minister I adore, and he always disagrees with me. He says, nonviolence is love all the way down, he says. And I said, well, I don't think so. Because the test of nonviolence is precisely like, what are you going to do when you really do want to do harm, when you really want to inflict violence, when you really want to destroy, right? What do you do then? Like, what kind of judgment or capacity to reroute or cultivate in another direction is there? And a lot of creative nonviolence relies on that capacity to work with rage, anger, aggression, even murderous impulse in ways that don't immediately convert into violent actions. But you've got to acknowledge that aggression and even that murderous impulse in order to work with it and craft it in some way. And I think that we don't just craft it as individuals, although maybe we do partially in psychotherapy, but even psychotherapy is a relationship. Right? It's something that, it's a change in the self that happens by virtue of a relationship, right?
A quarrel, as you say in the book.
A quarrel, yeah. But so I think it is a social struggle, nonviolence. It's dealing with the potential of destruction in every social relationship. And that, and I think that makes it a more realistic form of nonviolence, because it doesn't efface or rule out the aggressive or hateful components of our psychic lives. It actually, in some sense, works with them.
Right, which is why Freud is important here, right?
For that purpose, for
that
sure.
purpose. So, and then I've got two more thoughts. The reading of Freud in Lecture 4 is really interesting, on civilization, its discontents, group psychology. And, okay, so, Freud writes something called Mourning and Melancholia. People might have read it. And it appears that the book is about mourning, and the essay is about mourning and melancholia. But it's mainly about melancholia, right? Mourning is meant to, somebody dies, you grieve, you get over that, you rebind to yourself, you recover yourself, normal mourning, and then you're able to love again. But when that goes wrong, you fall into melancholy, right? And out of that melancholy, the self begins to fall apart, that agency of the superego conscience takes shape. You are a worthless piece of shit, you are a worthless piece of shit, you do not deserve to live. And we seem to be stuck in that melancholic structure for Freud. Except there's mania. And mania is a way of pushing melancholy aside. And I've never really, I take that seriously because I think that's, Freud says that's what happens when we get drunk. And I'm very interested in getting drunk. So in drunkenness is that feeling of you push aside your melancholy, right? You get the hangover the next morning and then it all comes back in a different way. but mourning, so melancholia, mania. But you want to give a political significance to mania in a way that I find very suggestive. So maybe, and I disagree with you a little bit. I disagree. No, I disagree. Yeah, okay. Because on this picture, the superego would be the bad guy. Right? Superego is the bad guy. Now, that's true. You're a worthless piece of shit. You're a worthless piece of shit. That voice, the punitive, obscene superego. But Freud, in 1927, writes a 5-page essay on humor called Humor. And Freud, who was very funny, I always think as a writer, is analyzing a joke. And the joke is the man that's been condemned to be hanged on the morning of his execution leaves his cell, goes out into the middle of the courtyard, the gallows is standing there, looks up at the sky and says, well, the week's beginning nicely. Right? And Freud says, what's going on here? And the conclusion he comes to in this tiny, tiny essay is that he says, we're used to the idea of the superego as a punitive, a severe master. But here's a superego that is different, a humorous superego. I can look outside myself. I can look outside myself and find myself funny, ridiculous. So it's not
Yes.
So melancholia isn't just pushed aside in mania.
Yeah.
It can be pushed aside in humor.
Yes, well, that's great. I mean, I think there is
My
a form
thought.
of self-deprecating humor
Right.
that would be maybe the best of melancholia. I accept that. I think maybe one would have to go back to the argument I was working with in Psychic Life of Power, which is a book
Right.
that was trying to figure out.
Remember you giving that as lectures at the University of Essex in 1990.
There you go. See, we go way back.
I go way back.
But, you know, there the question is what, it's one thing to be oppressed by a power outside of you. It's another thing to have internalized that power and to become the agent of your own oppression, right? So, and I was really struggling with that idea of what does it mean to internalize a subjugating power so that you become self-subjugating? Indeed, the external power doesn't even have to do any work because you're doing it all for that external power.
Mm-hmm.
And so it was in that context that I was interested in thinking about the superego as an instantiation of social power within the psyche.
Mm-hmm.
And also, I tried to read Mourning and Melancholia, which is sometimes taken to be a metapsychological essay, as maybe an essay in social theory. Maybe we could bring the social and the psychic together in some ways.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that returning to Freud in The Force of Nonviolence is in some ways returning to that problem of is the task to simply judge oneself for one's aggressive ideation or fantasy and try to repress that? Or is there another way of living with one's ambivalent psychic life? Because in melancholia, there's also rage against the one who is lost. I mean, A, because they're gone, and B, because you can't fight with them anymore.
Yeah.
And there's also this strange thing, like here you've lost someone terribly close to you, and the immediate response is to start punishing yourself. Right? That kind of peculiar, it's like one thing to have to deal with grief, it's another thing to find yourself in a suicidal mode of self-punishment, right?
Well,
That's,
Hamlet.
Yes.
Hamlet, his mother.
That's your text,
Yeah.
yes. So I am trying to think what's the modality of power in that, and is there another way of handling or trying to achieve nonviolence other than submitting to a brutal superego? And I mean, you're giving me another way of thinking about the superego, which I'm very grateful for. But my thought was that perhaps there's a way to not to liberate oneself from the superego, but to actually accept the condition of ambivalence without resolution and work with that as part of a social struggle. And we do that, I think, very often in social movements. We come to we fragment, we have conflicts, we denounce, we leave, we break, many things like that. But what does it mean, especially now when the stakes are so high, to stay in even when you want to leave? Not to strike even though you really want to, because these bonds continue to be important ones, and maybe they can be worked with in some way. It doesn't mean you love each other. And I really don't accept the idea that solidarity is love.
Love all the way down that.
Yes.
Okay.
I mean, I think Michael Hart disagrees with me here. He's a love guy, which is great. But I think the Deleuzians
It's great if you've got a monistic,
no. Well, the
Spinozist
Deleuzians
ontology.
are less ambivalent than the rest of us. But I think I don't necessarily think that solidarity is love. I think there is conflict. You do not have to love somebody to stand by them in a demonstration or to be part of a solidaristic network with them. They don't have to mirror you. You don't have to love them.
It's too Christian. Too Christian, isn't it? I was going to. A sign went up a few minutes ago saying Q&A.
Q&A.
So I think it's time for Q&A.
Oh,
but you're going to organise the Q&A.
Here come the hard questions.
Because
So maybe what we can do is take 3 questions from this side and have you respond, and then 3 questions from the other side and respond. How does that sound okay?
as you wish.
Okay, great.
Hello.
Hello.
I don't like microphones, but I will do my best. Thank you so much for being here. And everything that you say was pretty, very philosophical and deep to the level of psychology, I guess. But my question comes, how can we enact this force of nonviolence, where you were talking about also in social movements, but how can we enact that force when you have certain constraints? For instance, you work for the government, or you work for a corporation, or you're constrained in a certain way. How can you do that? That is very difficult, because when you're flowing through the social movement, you create this, but when you're constrained, how you do that? Maybe, yes, that is my question.
I have this question about nonviolence too. In the time that we are at, with the public, when we make public, for example, situations of violence that are that have been like erased for so much time, like for example, sexual harassment or sexual situations or rape in the families, for example. And now we have the social movement doing the public movement against this. And for me, and as a feminist too, it's like when we do this public denouncement, when we make this public denouncement, we somehow frame people as from a violent perspective, it will be like these people are framed, they are not worth it to be alive almost. And my question is, this is how I feel with the social movement sometimes. And I don't like violence on the other side. So my question is, how can we start imagining a world, in this moment, these people who are being denounced online or publicly, they already did the things that are wrong and that are obviously a crime. in case, let's say, you publish your father like raped you or something, that you are doing this, and your father or any person will be like seen as undesirable for humanity. But then we have to live with these people who already did this in our society. So how is it that we are in a moment of change? How can we, as a social movement, too, like, we make the denouncement and then what? We cannot erase the person, and the person is going to be there. So how, from the non-violence perspective, can do something about it? And that's my question.
Yeah.
Thank you both for being here in this place. I have just one question. At the beginning, Judith, of your comments, I thought I heard you setting up an opposition between social bonds and violence. And I wondered if you would address, and I might have misheard, how you think about, how you would encourage us to think about the social bonds that are created through violence. Because that's something I feel I'm living in and not as prepared as I should have been for that living, politically, psychically.
Yeah. Great. So thank you. These are all three excellent questions, and I am not sure I can do justice to them right here. But first of all, the question of how to practice nonviolence or these forms of solidarity when you're living under extreme constraints. You're employed by a corporation, a government, or you're living in a society that's imposing surveillance powers on you, or censorship, or threats of some kind. I think this is, maybe I could turn that around and say, when you're living under that circumstance, or when you're very economic subsistence depends on an employer or a government that is also subjugating you in some way, right? That's a heck of a bind. The need for forms of solidarity that can be built with others who are in that same condition is imperative. And that becomes a different mode of survival, and it becomes another potential mode of resistance. So one has to be able to make those networks of solidarity that are less official, that are not, that cross outside of those constraints. It doesn't mean that you deny those constraints, but you work under the radar sometimes in order precisely to develop the networks that can emerge as a form of solidarity, and even ultimately a powerful social movement. So, and I think there are many examples of that, and it's true we've talked philosophically, but we've also named some social movements that have done a pretty good job of that. One example is in Argentina, many of the women who are in unions said to the feminists who came to them, well, we can't really step outside the union because we need the union and they protect us and they protect our well-being. So the feminist movement built an intra-union network for women, right, which then became larger than all the unions. It's like beautiful. Okay. Anyway, I love that example. Okay. The second question, I think there are many issues that have been raised by the Me Too movement and the ways in which it has depended on media for denunciation. But let's remember this, that one reason it depends on media is that the courts have failed women for a very long time, right? It hasn't been so easy to move through the courts, especially because it becomes he said, she said, or you can't provide the evidence. Your own voice is not evidence enough in a court of law. So the media becomes a kind of extrajudicial tribunal, and that has some good features because it breaks through the silence and it lets us see just how pervasive harassment is. But it also can be driven by some pretty destructive animus, and what you said about somebody being named or accused of a crime and therefore being treated as not worthy of living anymore is a very dangerous situation. Now, you know, there's a long tradition of restorative and reparative justice in the feminist movement. And it has come from feminists like Angela Davis and others who have worked in prison systems and in the abolitionist movement, the movement to abolish prisons. And I think very often people who do prison work have to come to grips with the fact that, yes, somebody has committed a crime, but that does not nullify their humanity or their right to live. And so I think we have to struggle both to honor the claims of Me Too, but also to develop a non-carceral feminism, right? It won't do if we rely on punishment and imprisonment to achieve our goals. And I even think it won't do to rely on state power to achieve our goals. I've never thought that was true, and it was always my quarrel with Catherine McKinnon and that particular form of feminism. So that's an ongoing struggle for us, and I think that we need to have more public debate on that issue. Yes, there are social bonds that are forged through hatred and through xenophobia and through fascism. And so it's not that social bonds are good and lack of social bonds are bad, but it's rather that the aggression in every social bond, the destructive potential in every social bond, whether it's a destruction between people in a social group or the destruction waged by a social group against an external group, targeted as such, that is precisely what calls to be identified and worked with so that it does not convert into violence. And by violence, I'm not just talking about the physical blow. I'm also talking about symbolic and institutional violence, systemic forms of violence. And I would say the migration policy of this U.S. is a violent policy, right? The violence on the border exemplifies a policy that is a systemic form of violence, right? We can point to the examples, but the examples really illustrate the systemic feature of that violence. So that would be a case where U.S. nationalism, heralded by our current executive officer, would consolidate on the basis of a rabid xenophobia and racism. And so, I mean, but that's precisely the kind of phantasmagoria that I'm trying to, racial phantasmagoria, that I'm trying to counter. The most popular example of which is the migrant from Mexico who comes in and commits criminal acts, right? And that becomes a kind of way of understanding migration or the aims of migrants. So it's not as if social bonds are good. Social bonds are vexed. They're vexed, and it is true that forms of nationalism do emerge through the identification and projection onto enemy groups, but that's precisely to commit a form of radical social inequality, right? That's a scene of radical social inequality, which is why I think nonviolence has to be thought through the norm of social equality. We could talk more about that, but we'll take some questions from this other side.
So questions on this side, right? Is the this side? I'm going to stand because I don't want
Who's
to
got
be
the mic?
disrespectful, and I'm like behind everybody.
Okay. Oh, hang on. What are we doing this side?
Yeah.
this-
Oh.
So, yeah.
Okay.
So thank you for being here. I've been a fan of yours ever since my undergrad years, and now as a grad student, I tend to appreciate your writing even more. And my question is regarding young women that are being trained in male-dominated fields within academia. And I wonder if you have any sort of like advice for women that are, you know, confronted with this macho ideology within academic, sort of like male-dominated fields, and how one could approach this non-violence mentality.
Well, my first bit of advice is not to live inside the institution. Right? Like, make sure you have a vibrant community outside of the university. And that you're connected with people who support you. And that you also develop networks that can support you every step of the way, and don't allow the meritocracy model to guide your actions. Don't act alone. Like, never act alone. Find your people. I don't know, that's what I think.
Hi. I'd like to maybe try to figure out how we as a culture can make this sort of philosophical leap from this concept of nonviolence as you've described, a sort of passive gendered, this idea that turning the other cheek is a form of like passive tolerance, that you're just setting yourself up for more violence by not resisting. And being able to make that leap to say that no, nonviolent resistance is perhaps not only a way of bearing witness and creating a space where you can identify the injustice, but an active refusal to participate.
Mm-hmm. Well, I'm not interested in turning the other cheek. That's never been my pathway. So I'm glad that you did say nonviolent resistance, right? And then I guess the question is, how do we think about the social forms that takes? I'm losing the thread of this question.
It's kind of restating, how can you argue for the force of nonviolence is kind of the question.
Yeah.
It's kind of restating the thesis of the book.
Yeah. Well, I guess you would have to look at mobilizations that are committed to nonviolence and see the kinds of effectiveness they can have. I think there are anti-war mobilizations that have been very powerful. They may not have brought an end to all war, but they're still powerful. And I think that there are feminist LGBTQ mobilizations that are nonviolent that are very powerful. I think there are anti-fascist mobilizations that are to some large degree nonviolent that are very important. I think we can name those and we can see how they work. I guess the point I want to make, though, and maybe I said this at the beginning and it's worth returning, when we're involved in social movements and political struggles, how we act in them and what kind of action we take in their name. And this is also true for thinking about the struggle for Palestine as well. How we do that embodies the principles that we want to see realized in the world. So we could say, oh, well, we're in a movement to achieve justice, yes, but are we ourselves embodying justice as we act in that movement? And I want to go back to the idea of praxis. It's a good Marxist concept, which I think people have lost, because the idea of praxis is that you embody the end in the means, right? It's not that you're instrumental, like, oh, I'm going to do this to achieve this end. I am embodying the end I want to see in the means that I use. So that's where I'm trying to lead us to that maybe political ethos, if we can speak that way.
Hi.
Hi. I'm a Puerto Rican woman, and from my perspective, everything that's been happening in Puerto Rico, I think, has been especially led by women.
Mm-hmm.
And the advocacy, the protest, everything from the awareness to being actually there in front of the police. How can we think of this nonviolent stance without kind of turning it inwards to ourselves? Because I think we have very good practice. The state violence, we tend to turn it inward. The idea that poverty, you're poor because you want to be poor.
Oh.
We tend to kind of internalize the state violence. How do we not internalize violence within this stance?
Yeah, that's a really excellent question. But it seems to me that some of the debt collectives and the people who are politicizing, especially debt in Puerto Rico, are doing an incredible job of elaborating that analysis and also engaging in forms of public action and assembly that do an analysis in public, right? I mean, we think, oh, philosophy's over here, social criticism's over here, and then there's real political action. It's like, I think that there are modes of organization and assembly that we're seeing, and I believe we're seeing this in Puerto Rico as well, where the actual political analysis is happening in public, and that is informing people's actions and their self-consciousness about their condition. And I think the more public that gets, the less likely it is that kind of terrible self-blame or internalization takes place. I think as well, we need, the analysis of what's happening in Puerto Rico has to also be linked with the problem of debt and precarity throughout the world that has been accelerated and intensified under what we can call neoliberal conditions or advanced capitalist conditions, depending on your analysis. But it needs to link with that, and the stronger that analysis is, the less likely I think we are to internalize. Some of that internalization has to happen in, combating that internalization has to happen in smaller groups, but I think it needs to be politicized and publicized as much as possible.
Hi. Thank you so much. I want to talk about some areas that I think you don't consider. I think you presume a minimum possibility of non-violent action. I'm from Iran, and in there, the situation is completely different. For example, from Argentina, you mentioned as an example. Every social movement is destroyed. There is no space for non-violent action. And, the people every day are discussing this issue that is violence the only or not only way of making change? I wish you had this discussion in Iran and you would see the audience reaction. All of them believe that, not all of them, but they are still discussing this issue that they cannot do anything without rescuing to violence, even if violence would be the birthplace of another violence and chain. And thank you.
I think the question you raise is a very crucial one, and what you're describing is something that's totalitarian or near totalitarian, so that social movements and resistance movements will be quashed whenever they start to appear. And yet, I think I also know that there are ways in which people are networking in Iran beneath the radar that are actually quite impressive. and that people know how to get out onto the street, and that they're also struggling against terrible prison conditions. I think what is interesting is what form those kinds of networks and solidarities take that are not hyper-visible, right? That actually reject the model of hypervisibility in order to be effective. So, you know, one problem that I think sometimes happens in, I don't know, in US discourse on social movements is that we think, you know, the more visible, the better, but in many places, the less visible, the more effective. Yeah. So that would be the kind of conversation I would be interested in having and understanding better.
All right, folks. I know that there are some hands that are up. There are some books that need to be signed and more conversations to be had. I want us all to thank Judith and Simon for this very powerful and meaningful conversation. Thank you both for coming. You're welcome here anytime, as is everyone on the audience. Their books are back there. We're going to very quickly make a line, or two lines, one for the purchase of books and the other one for signing. So if you hear any of the TPF staff say, can you please move? That means that we're setting up for you to do what you need to do. Thank you all. And so if you are purchasing a book, you might want to go on my right-hand side. My left-hand side is for signing. My right-hand side is for purchasing books.
Think of me as security.